Last year, a buddy and I decided to go camping in the Coconino National Forest area in Arizona. We were both needing to escape the stress that had built up and just to immerse ourselves in nature for a while. Our plan was to stay for several days and take things pretty easy. When we got there, we set up our camp near a lake so we could try out my new canoe. The first couple days went great. We were hiking and fishing and canoeing, and we were finally starting to decompress. On the third day, we were relaxing at the campsite after hiking in the morning. Suddenly, we both caught a whiff of something foul-smelling, like a garbage can on a hot day. Of course, we both started joking and accusing each other of being the guilty culprit. We laughed it off and figured it was just a passing smell. But about an hour later, I was fishing by the shoreline of the lake when I caught the same foul smell again. It was a lot stronger this time, and I couldn't ignore it. I looked around trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, but I didn't see anything. It was unnaturally strong though, and it was bothering me not to be able to identify it. I walked back to the campsite, and the smell stayed strong. We looked everywhere around the campsite, but we still came up empty-handed. As the day went on, the smell kept coming and going. Then, when we were cooking dinner later, we started hearing something that sounded like someone chopping wood a couple hundred yards up the hill behind us. It went on for about 10 minutes, with intervals in between, and we couldn't help but feeling a little unnerved by it. We were wondering who would be chopping wood at this time at night when it was so dark. The thing is, the chopping was coming from a wooded area where there were no campsites. We kind of wanted to investigate, but we decided it probably wasn't the best idea to wander into the forest at night. The chopping sound eventually completely stopped. Then, there was this really deep silence that seemed to hang in the air. We tried to shake it off and focus on cooking dinner, but we couldn't help feeling a little spooked by it. We eventually relaxed and were drinking and talking when suddenly we heard a deep, throaty bellow. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the hills above us and made us both stop talking immediately. I knew for a fact that there is no wildlife in Arizona that could make that kind of noise. We decided to move our tent and other camping gear right up to the shore of the lake. We figured whatever was out there would have a harder time sneaking up on us from that direction at least. But we were feeling pretty nervous by then. We thought about packing up and heading for the truck, which was on the other side of the lake by the road we had driven in on. But it had taken us a half an hour to walk to our campsite on the first day, and we didn't want to risk running into whatever had made that sound. We decided to stay put and keep a close eye out. We made sure to keep the fire going, thinking that that might deter whatever it was. Probably about an hour after we heard the bellow, we heard the chopping wood sound again, but this time it was further away than the first time we heard it. It just didn't make sense. Then, about 10 minutes later, we heard footsteps coming towards us along the shoreline. We shone our flashlights in that direction, and we saw a guy and girl heading towards us carrying a bunch of gear. When they got closer, we could see that they looked scared, and we asked if they heard that strange bellowing sound. They said that they had, and they were too worried to stick around. We discussed our options and decided that it might be best if we just banded together and hiked back to the forest road where our vehicles were parked. We packed up our gear and headed out, trying to look in every direction while we walked. The whole time we were walking to the road, that foul smell was in the air again. It was seriously overwhelming. As we approached the road, we heard this loud snap of a branch, and the girl started running ahead of us. Then, about halfway between us and the girl, this giant thing stepped out of the trees. It was like a 7-foot-tall ape covered in this dark, shaggy hair. It was huge and really buff with these huge shoulders and chest and just really no neck. It was probably only 50 feet away from us. The girl had kept running, and we couldn't even see her anymore. The three of us just stood there like morons gaping at this thing. Then it let out this bellowing scream. It was like a jolt of adrenaline had shot through us, and we all just started sprinting up the road as fast as we could. We were gasping for breath, but we didn't stop until we reached our vehicles and drove the hell out of there. That thing was terrifying. You wouldn't believe how huge it was. No way in hell would I ever try to camp in that area again. I wish we had a way to contact the couple so we could talk about what had happened, because I'm sure it was a Sasquatch. But it seems if you mention Sasquatch to the uninitiated, they pretty much put you in the crazy box right away. Anyway, I'll be interested to hear if any of your listeners have had any weird experiences in that area. I used to explore this nature reserve with one of my old friends. We lived a bit north of Roanoke, if you're familiar with that part of the country. The reserve was located between my dad's house and my friend's house, but it was a little awkward to access it. To reach it, you would have to trek through the woods behind my friend's house and pass through an abandoned hunting club area in order to get to this hidden trail. That would take you to an old road that led to another trail. And finally, you'd get to the nature reserve. All that to say, it was not well known and had become its own little wilderness. This time I'm talking about, my friend and I had gone out around 2 a.m. It was shortly after a big storm had passed, so everything was damp and there were quite a few broken branches. We were feeling kind of nervous and weird out there since it was the first time we had explored the area at night. My friend had dared me to sneak out of my dad's house, so obviously I had to prove myself. While we were walking, it was like every sound was amplified. We just kept jumping at every little noise that we heard. We kept waving our flashlights in every direction, thinking some animal was about to jump out at us. We lost the trail multiple times, and that only made us a little more jittery. When we finally got going the right way, we looked back at where we had been, and we saw not far off, maybe about 60 or 70 feet, there was somebody sitting on a stump. It wasn't right by the trail that we had walked down, but off to the side by a clump of trees. It really freaked us out. We didn't know if we had walked right by him or not noticed, or if he had appeared there after we had passed. It seemed like a very large figure in dark clothing. We were only able to make him out because the moon had just come out from some cloud cover, and to me, it looked like he was more crouched on top of the stump rather than sitting on it. But I figured the lack of light was playing tricks on me. We turned and kept going the way we were supposed to be going, and we were just whispering to each other about how freaking weird that was. We went through a lot of rationalizations and tried to put it out of our minds. After all, if we could sneak around at night, why might someone else not also have that urge? But needless to say, we were definitely on edge. We weren't expecting to see other people out there at night. We decided to head back to the old road, but not to backtrack on that trail on accounting or wanting to avoid whoever that was. At that point, our adrenaline was really pumping. I don't even understand why we had that level of fear, really. I think we were just amping each other up, but it was one of those few times I saw real fear in my friend's eyes. A lot of times when we would just get startled on one of our adventures, he would try to ramp it up and freak me out more. But this time, he was getting pretty spooked. I tried to chalk it up as being dark and late, and we had already spent a considerable amount of time lost and unable to find the trail. But then, the weird shriek started. I would be lying if I said I wasn't freaking the hell out in that moment. There were these horrible loud whooping shrieks. It was so shocking to hear that sound come out of the dark woods like that. I tried to tell myself that it was probably just an animal. We froze and tried to force our eyes to be able to see through the trees. My flashlight was pretty ineffective in those thick woods. If I had to guess, I would say the sound was definitely coming from the direction where we had seen that figure. Then there was a sound a lot like the branches breaking at once. It sounded like something was crashing through the trees, but not at ground level. It sounded like it was above us, like something had landed on a tree above our heads. Then everything got extremely quiet. We both looked up at the same time, and with total horror, we saw these red eyes looking down at us. They were probably about 20 feet up in the air. I felt like we were face to face with something otherworldly. Even though I felt like I shouldn't, like I would probably be angering this thing, I aimed my flashlight up and saw something out of my nightmares. It was the size of a man, but it had these huge wings that covered most of its body. I couldn't tell if they were made from feathers or something leathery like a bat, you know what I mean? It seemed faceless beside the red eyes. In spite of my fear, I couldn't look away. I was mesmerized by this creature that defied all logic and understanding. In that moment, I felt like I should have been running, but I just couldn't move. The thing was mesmerizing, and weirdly, I somehow felt like it didn't intend to hurt us. But then my friend grabbed me and pulled me away, and we were just basically crashing through the trees and stumbling onto the road. I was so glad that we had been so close to the road. Once we were on it, we totally knew our way back and ran all the way back until we collapsed on my friend's front porch. We could barely speak at that point, and if we could have, we didn't know what to say. We just tried to calm down enough to go inside the house without waking anybody up. We literally never went back to that area, even though there's this really weird part of me that wants to go see if it would happen again. When you're raised by a single mom, sometimes you end up playing kind of a caretaker role to your own parent, since there's not another adult around. That's what kind of happened to me. I didn't mind. I love my mom, and we always just took care of each other. We lived in Michigan, and she was working as a manager of a lodge. It was a demanding job, but my mom was always dedicated to her work and took pride in what she did. I remember going to work with her sometimes and seeing how hard she worked to keep everything running smoothly. The lodge where my mom worked was located near one of the bays off Lake Michigan, and it was a beautiful area. But the hours of her job were pretty long, and sometimes she wouldn't get off work until around midnight. During one winter break from school when I was around 15, I would walk down to meet her at work and walk her back home because she didn't like to walk home alone in the dark. I didn't mind doing it because I would usually be up late playing video games anyway, and it only took me about 15 minutes to walk to the lodge. Plus, I could take my dogs with me, which meant I could get the dog walking done at the same time. It was a nice little routine we had going, and it made me feel good to know that I could help her out in some small way. So this one night, when I walked to the lodge to meet my mom after work, she still had a lot of paperwork to do. I didn't want just to sit and wait for her, so I decided to take my dogs for a walk around the grounds of the lodge. It was around 12:30 at night, in the dead of winter, so it was really cold and quiet outside. It seemed like everyone inside the lodge had gone to sleep, and the only sounds that we heard were gusts of wind and the snow crunching. The grounds covered quite a bit of acreage, and it wasn't far from the water's edge. The footpath went through some thick woodlands and out of view of the lodge. I was walking along and not paying much attention. I knew the path like I knew the back of my hand, but then I realized my dogs had stopped walking. Then they started growling like mad with their hackles up and the whole bit. I looked around and I could feel that we weren't alone out there anymore. There was something standing a little ways ahead of us, partially obscured by the trees. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but I felt like we needed to get out of there fast. I went to turn around and head back to the lodge. My heart started pounding like crazy. My mind was playing all sorts of horror movie style scenes. I imagined something lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on us. And then, suddenly, it was like the tree line exploded as something really big ran out of it. It was taller than a normal person and moving incredibly fast. My dogs went wild with their barking. I was really glad they were leashed, otherwise they would have just torn off after that thing. I could barely hold them back, and they're just small dogs. The thing that I had seen was way taller than me. If I had to guess, I would say that it's like 8 feet tall. I don't know how I knew, but I just felt like it wasn't a human or an animal, which obviously makes no sense, but it had a horrifying presence about it. Like you could feel this feeling of death around it, like something really unnatural, like something had crawled out of a grave or something. In that brief moment when it crossed my vision, it looked like it had shreds of flesh hanging off of it, and its eyes had flashed red for 1 second before it crossed back into the trees. I felt like it was something capable of possessing you, like a demon. I stood there just basically frozen. I couldn't shake this feeling that this creature was there watching us. I had the sense that it hadn't gone much farther than the other side of the tree line. The fear I felt in that moment was something that I had never experienced before. It was a gut-wrenching fear that seemed to grip me and hold me in place, like my body was too shocked to move. My mind was screaming with a million thoughts and questions, but my body wouldn't budge. Like I said, we weren't far from the water, but before I could find a rational thought, I could hear that thing going away from us. The sound of the creature running towards the water was deafening somehow. I don't know how it could be so loud. The sound was like something out of a nightmare, and then I heard it thrashing in the water, and I remember feeling a sense of relief that it was finally leaving. I managed to turn around and get the dogs to follow me back towards the lodge. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down for a second. I felt like every nerve on my body was on fire. When I finally made it back to the lodge, I was out of breath and shaking. All I cared about was getting inside, locking the door, and never looking back. After that night, I was never quite the same. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, always on high alert for anything out of the ordinary. It took me a long time to shake the feeling that something was always watching me. It was hard to make my mom understand how horrifying that creature had been. If you never experienced something like that, how could you possibly understand? I was so glad when she changed jobs. We moved to a suburb of Grand Rapids, and I felt a whole lot more comfortable there.